gets misused so much, but misinformation in regards to how many years we have left until something no longer exists, like farmland that produces. That is changing, and it's changing fast. The farmland used to be farmed, the way my grandfather farmed 60 years ago was devastating to the land. And he didn't know any different. He farmed the way his father had farmed and the way they'd farmed before. And they really did take without giving back to the land. They not by any intention. It was just they weren't educated to do it correctly.
Right. And this is referring to over-tilling every year without cycling crops and heavy fertilizer use, right?
That's correct. I mean, the land, he farmed out on the prairies, the shortgrass prairie, the thick sod had lots of life to it and lots of nutrients. And when they first broke that ground and seeded it to wheat, it produced huge wheat crops. So what they would do is they would seed it to wheat or oats or barley or whatever that grain crop was. They would harvest the grain off. They would take the straw off in the form of bales for bedding, and then they would burn whatever stubble was left because they believed that the stubble was a problem, but they didn't really know why. They didn't have an understanding of why. Well, in essence, what they did is they got rid of all of their organic matter off the land, 100% of it when they would harvest. And then they would leave nothing there to catch snow. And so the wintertime, the snow would just blow across that land and, collect in ditches and grassland or wherever. But the land itself was left barren and dry. And so then the topsoil would start to blow. And the following year, they would put the land to rest. And I think there's actually a biblical reference to allowing the land to rest, but I think they misinterpreted it. And so their idea of allowing the land to rest was to till under anything that stuck its head up.
Oh no.
Right?
That's not what they meant.
So, well, no, totally. If there was a weed, man, they were out there with the cultivator knocking it down again.
Yeah.
And so they would till everything under, essentially drying out the surface of the land all summer long, and leaving the earth loose so that if there was a downpour of rain, the topsoil would wash away, and if there was a windstorm, the topsoil would blow away, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and all the micronutrients that are down in the first 6 inches of the soil all get brought up and burnt away by the sun.
Right. So they did this for 6 to 10 decades, somewhere between 60 and 100 years to the prairies, and just devastated a lot of that land. And then people started to wise up. So in my father's generation, you've maybe heard this before. My dad was a soil scientist and was very knowledgeable about what it was going to take to bring that soil back. And those farmers did one of two things. They either quit farming in that age category, or they changed their farming practices because the land would no longer sustain those old school practices. And they hired agrologists, some of them. In the case of my father was the agrologist, so he didn't hire someone. But they started to put energy and resources back into the land. And that doesn't mean chemical fertilizer only. It may mean that they used some to give the land a boost, because sometimes the land needs a little copper, or it needs a little phosphorus, or it needs a little nitrogen to get a boost. But then they also seeded land that was marginal into crops like alfalfa that have super deep roots and could help them mitigate the alkali that had come to the surface. And in essence, also put a whole bunch of fiber back into that same soil, stabilized it. And plants like alfalfa, or they started seeding a lot of other legumes like peas and lentils and so on. All of those things are nitrogen fixers. And so they naturally start to put nitrogen back into the soil, along with these long roots that break down and recreate the soil. So, in a world of monocropping out on the prairies, that began to rejuvenate a lot of that. And then they started working a lot more again with the ranchers. Manure for years just was sat in piles, giant piles. And suddenly it was like there was an awakening of farmers to say, well, let's put this back on the ground. Also I would say it was the late 70s and into the 80s, they went from swathing and combining. So swathing is when they cut the crop before it's 100% ready to combine, and then they leave it laying in the field, kind of curing or hardening, and then they pick it up with the combine, which requires them to have quite short stubble when they do that, because if the stubble's too tall, the crop falls through the tall stubble and it's really hard to pick up.
Right.
So you're left with that really short stubble, which doesn't catch much snow. Well, in the late 70s, early 80s, they started doing what's called straight combining. So they would put the big swather type headers on the front of the combine. They would let the crop mature standing, and then they would rip around the field and just take off just the grain, leaving sometimes 2 or 3 feet of straw standing.
Oh, wow.
Right. And then over the course of the winter, that would fill up with snow. So now you got 2 or 3 feet of fairly compact moisture, because as it blows, of course, it's quite dense, which would then melt into the ground. And now that heavy prairie soil has, tons of moisture in it, and they just because of that, they would grow much better crops. And all of the straw that was left standing when they would seed into the previous field, well, that straw now went into the ground to decompose, and the microbes started to multiply again, and so on and so forth. And so a lot of that land is in considerably better shape than it was when I was a kid.
Fascinating.
So that's a long answer to the little thing where you said, you may have heard that in 60 years, the land won't produce anything. Mm-hmm. Well, I would believe that if they kept farming the way they had 50 years ago, but they're not.
Right.
And so a lot of the garbage that we hear now coming out of, our own federal government or whatever, screaming that the farmers need to reduce their use of nitrogen by 30%. It's like, hold on. These guys hire agrologists. They're business people. They don't use any more nitrogen than they have to, because, hey, it costs money, man.
Yeah.
And so they are looking at every possible option not to buy nitrogen if they can help it, right? They understand, these young farmers understand that if they don't put back into the land, that it costs them money. Mm-hmm. So they need to, keep the microbes alive and put the organic matter back into the soil.
Yeah.
So that's changed a lot.
Cool. So on that note, let's kind of tie these two subjects back. How do you decide what you're going to plant in your little garden? Is it purely economics, like this vegetable costs this much at the store, I can grow it for this much and this much square footage? Or is it more what grows best? Or how do you decide?
A lot of it has to do with what tastes better, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
You grow your own tomatoes, man. You can hold them out at arm's length and smell them. They smell fantastic, right?
Yep.
You go to the store and you pick a tomato out of there and you put it right to your nose. It doesn't smell like anything.
Right, because those are GMOs that are bred to be shelf stable for a really long time.
That's part of it, yeah. And then the tomato that you get on the shelf has been picked super green. It was as green as a green apple when it was picked.
Right.
It wasn't allowed to vine ripen, and when things vine ripen, that's when they get a lot of their flavor. So that poor thing was picked green. Then it was, sent to a sorting house somewhere before it was shipped. It was likely, and I say likely because there's chances that it wasn't, but most of that is treated with a product called chlorine dioxide, which sounds really horrible, but it's actually not one of the most toxic things on the planet. But what chlorine dioxide does is it kills funguses and things that might be on that fruit, and that allows it to ship, because obviously if the fungus reproduced, well, it would rot. Chlorine dioxide has this one other byproduct, and that is that it pretty much takes the smell out of everything. Oh. And so you can use chlorine dioxide on the nastiest smells out there and make them go away. So when you treat your food with chlorine dioxide, the food is gone, or the smell is gone. If you get flowers, cut flowers from overseas, you can't. They don't smell like anything,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, we
They
bought
don't
we
smell
bought a
like
bunch of
the same reason.
bananas from Costco last week. Just got a Costco membership, and they sat on our table for 2 weeks, and they were still hard as a rock and green. Couldn't believe it.
Yeah, wild, eh? Yeah. So anyway, so how do we decide what to grow? Number one is, what do we want um, that we really like, and things like tomatoes for sure, right? Homegrown potatoes, for whatever reason, seem to taste way better,
Hmm.
and
What
and
kind
and
what
it's
kind of
easy to
potatoes
grow.
do you plant? You plant more than
Last year
one?
we grew mostly russets,
Okay, cool.
red russets,
Yeah.
but we've grown different varieties. And one of the great things about potatoes is that there's lots of varieties, and if your ground for whatever reason is causing scabies on one kind of potato, it might not on another. And
Yeah.
so if you have diversified different kinds of potatoes, it's good. Same with tomatoes. I mean, you can grow 15 different varieties of tomatoes, and if for some reason one of them doesn't do well that year, there's a good chance that others will do just fine. So we always grow lots of different kinds of tomatoes, and a lot of the decisions are made based on what we want to put away in fall. So um, my wife does a lot of spaghetti sauce, salsa, and just canning
Hmm.
tomatoes and whatnot. But different tomatoes are good for different things. Um, I started growing parsnips, and not so much to eat, but this is a decision. Like, why would you grow parsnips?
Oh,
Especially if you don't
I
even
grew
really
I grew
eat
parsnips
parsnips.
last year, and they outgrew all my carrots, and I they keep for a long time. I kept them for a few months in like the vegetable drawer, and just
Right.
so flavorful. I used to hate them as a kid, but man, they just pack a punch of flavor.
Okay, so and then the second thing is if you leave some of them in the ground, let them come back a second year because they'll that same parsnip will come up on year two.
Uh-huh.
And on year two, it will bloom. You're not going to want to eat this plant at
Right,
all,
right.
but it's going to bloom. And when it blooms, it attracts every beneficial predatory insect you can imagine.
Oh, wow.
Absolutely covered with wasps and, the little tiny bug eating wasps and ladybug larvae and all sorts of stuff. And so having those kind of plants in your garden go a real long way to helping defend your other plants,
Mm.
right? The stuff that they attack. So that's really part of it as well.
Yeah, I guess I'll just
Growing,
touch. I'll just drop in here my kind of my overarching thesis of the useful things that I figured out after all going down all the rabbit holes of how messed up the world is that the one single simplest solution. I've always tried to find like what's the one domino you can push that will fix all the world's problems, right? As an individual, not as like a collective, and that's growing a garden. If the world is truly is dependent, or if the climate is as dependent on carbon as we think it is, and if our supply chains are as fragile as we say they are, it's the number one thing you can do to save the planet and improve your quality of life, like you say about the quality of produce that you produce yourself. Is to just grow a garden. You don't have any greenhouse gas emissions shipping things across the country. You got better quality, and it's like it's a spiritual thing too. Just to go out there and like have your hands in the dirt and the sun. There's something so human that I think our modern world has disconnected us from, that we all kind of need, is that some dirt under your fingernails and the sun in your eyes.
yeah, you bet. Recently I've been studying grounding, and I
Hmm.
don't know if you're familiar with that, but that makes a great segue into grounding, that's for sure. And grounding, you know, in about 1960, I was watching a documentary last night. In about 1960, plastics, specifically the plastics that go into the soles of our shoes, were created, and it became this really inexpensive, durable product that is on 99% of our shoes now.
Hmm.
But what we inadvertently did is we insulated ourselves from the earth, and we lost contact with the earth. And before that, most shoes had leather soles. And